move on to topic C, which deals with the site allocations. Everyone happy to go for another half an hour before we take a break?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. I want to ask about the parish council's position with regard to flooding. Is the aim to keep development to avoid medium and high risk flood zones where possible, or is it the approach that comes in the MPPF, which is to steer development to areas at lowest risk of flooding? So basically, is it we could allocate land that is liable to flood rather than the MPPF approach, which is to avoid allocating land to areas with the lowest risk of flooding, and then we'll move on to what are the difference between areas at low risk of flooding and the areas of lowest risk to flooding.
Okay, I think it's most definitely to allow development in the higher risk areas subject to strict constraints and mitigation being shown for that. Remember that we started with a figure of 33/48 in mind, and we had no idea which sites might satisfy that number when we set out, so we had to take them all into account. As we set out in our written response, the flood risk aspects were looked at by 3 specialist organisations, and we leaned heavily on their advice in carrying forward. So add to that an allocation policy where applicable will have measures to prevent built development taking place in the risk areas. So that essentially is a green area or a blue area. So in that sense, I think we still comply with the MPPF criterion you mentioned.
So where you're allocating, all the developable areas are areas at the lowest risk of flooding, or are there parts of the plan area that are at lower risk of flooding?
Yeah, there are whole swathes of the plan area that are at the, they don't even feature as shading on the environmental agency's maps because they're at the very, unquantifiable low risk.
Right.
But
is that not the intention of the MPPF and the sequential approach to,
well,
if possible, to allocate development and use that as the starting point?
If possible is very pertinent there, because if we adopted that approach, large numbers, if not all of our, or many of our allocated sites would have had to been not allocated because they don't fall into the zone or area that you mentioned. And I think if we're to take a positive approach to growth, which we're very keen to do, it's a more logical approach to say, yeah, we appreciate there are problems. We've gone through the sequential test. We've introduced measures that mitigate those problems. We are not building on the high risk areas. We have some areas of land in a site that go into medium risk areas. But I think to do otherwise would hinder growth significantly.
Can I ask Chris, from the if a planning application came in for development in these areas and we weren't talking about allocated sites where there's no requirement to do a sequential test, if it came that as a planning application, a windfall planning application, on an area which is identified as even possibly being at low risk of flooding, but a risk of flooding. Would you expect them to, the sequential approach, to demonstrate that there are no available sites available at a lower risk of flood?
Well, that's the approach in the MPPF. And that's been the conventional approach. And I think our EM09 may seek to take a slightly different approach in that. I don't think reading it actually discounts that in totality. Because I think one paragraph highlights proposals for vulnerable development in medium and higher flood risk zones must be accompanied by site-specific flood risk assessment, etc.
Yeah,
so
I think it's
so I don't think, our local plan policy takes a slightly different twist to the NPPF, so I don't think that NPPF would.
Right, so you're more, so from the Breckland point of view, you're fairly relaxed in terms of the approach that the parish council has taken to site selection in terms of demonstrating a sequential approach.
Yeah, I think we're comfortable in terms of the information and evidence and process they've been through. It's, as I say, we've always, it's a case-by-case basis, unfortunately. With certain applications, so I think we'd probably, we'd have to review each application on its merits, unfortunately.
Okay. Before I bring you in, when I was looking at the site assessment report that ACON did, and that was identifying sites in flood zones 2 and 3 and saying sites aren't in flood zone 2 and 3, but they are saying it is subject to surface water flooding requiring mitigation. I think the more up-to-date approach is to identify sites that are vulnerable to flooding, which, whether it's fluvial or any kind of flooding. And I know that there was a subsequent examination on behalf of that, but I just really wanted to understand how ACON had sort of looked at it, because that was the first sieve in terms of a sequential approach that was allowing sites that subject to flooding to move forward.
Yeah. Okay.
The ACON work was the first sieve, but to their credit, the Neighbourhood Plan Group worked very closely with the local flood authority, transport agency, so on and so forth. And the site selection report is a really, really important report to be mindful of. I know it's very long and you can't read it from beginning to end, but there's a table in there called Table 38 on page 94 that applies a sequential approach to every single one of those sites.
Right.
And you can see where they all fit in that order.
Okay.
Then, so I think in Chris's written response to your question, he has highlighted the 2 sites and what then, with some surface water flood risk and how that was fed through to the redefining the site boundary for STNP 1 and so on and so forth. I think it's quite fully explained. Yeah.
In terms of, and I guess this might be one for Breckland, areas at low risk of surface water flooding, are they the same as flood zone 1? Are they a different category?
There are other sources of flooding, and this comes back to a point Rachel made earlier, that people home in on fluvial zones 1, 2 and 3 and forget, because it's not explicitly defined as this, that high, medium and low risk surface water areas should be considered in the same way. And that's the key to this, that surface water flooding where it happens is equally as important as fluvial where that happens. Just to jump back, your original point about the MPPF, I have to say we have complied in the sense that we could only allocate sites that came forward. And we've gone through the 18 to do that. So we couldn't say, there's other land in the village that's at lower risk, we're going to allocate there, because land in those areas did not come forward. So we've done whatever was possible to meet the MPPF requirement in that sense. And Rachel's quite right to say ACOM was the starting point. The fact that ACOM addresses surface water is as a result of our comments on their draft report, when it did simply focus on fluvial and told us that sites we knew to be at surface water flood risk had no flood risk. So they updated the report accordingly. But
what they were saying is it's subject to flood risk, which will need to be mitigated,
yes,
as opposed to using it as a basis and saying you shouldn't be looking at this site.
Yeah, they defined sites as suitable with constraints mitigated, or not suitable. And Rachel's quite right to point you at the selection report, which goes into further detail. It includes the flood authority's more specialist review. ACOM were looking at a range of issues. The flood authority were looking purely at flood risk and homed in, and gave us some very good information that guided the site selections. And likewise, they didn't do it in a traffic light way so much, but they essentially did the same. These sites are at such high risk that we recommend you do not allocate them. These sites are at some risk, but it should be possible to mitigate, subject to information coming forward in a planning application. I stress that, not subject coming forward in a condition to a planning application, but in a planning application, which reinforces the policies. And we abided entirely by their recommendations, and then took it forward, as Rachel said, with the table she referred to, where we look at individual sites and shape the criteria for those particular sites to help mitigate the flood risk.
Okay. That is on the basis that would the lead flood authority recommend a sequential approach to avoid development from areas subject to surface water flooding, in preference to areas that are subject to surface water flooding but which can be mitigated?
I don't want to speak on behalf of the flood authority, and I haven't got their guidance in front of me, but the clear implication of their site assessments was that certain sites in flood risk areas, which were 1, 3, 4, 7, 9, and one other planning application, were suitable for development, subject to mitigation of the risk. Others were not suitable for development, full stop.
Okay. All right. Right. I think there is only one more question I want to ask for this, and I think I've drawn the implication from looking at the Environment Agency's surface water flooding map, but it comes from the experience I've had. I've helped prepare neighbourhood plans on the River Thames at Braesbury, which was subject to very, very extensive flooding in 2014 from the River Thames. There, the issue is accessibility in times of flood for emergency vehicles. Is there any, and that is one of the criteria in terms of the exception tests and such like. I presume that whilst the road at the eastern side of the village, and I'm sorry, I haven't got the name of it, is the main area, that emergency vehicles can get in, and ambulances, and get people out, and others via other routes. That it's not actually, the extent of flooding isn't such that emergency vehicles can't get through.
The most extreme flood in recent history is 2016. Emergency vehicles attended those events.
Excellent, thank you. That's helpful. Back when I had a proper job, I was city planning officer at Portsmouth, where half the island, well, no, actually about a third of the Portsea Island is in the one in 200-year flood event, and these issues of people providing ribs as emergency vehicles. You know, the scenario is someone has a heart attack and the ambulance service can't actually get to it, and that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, and I think, John, if I may, just to stress to us, that is also the importance of policy 8G, because we do see applications. There's an application at the moment that states that in a different part of the village, flood water may reach 900 millimetres depth in an extreme event. Well, that is both too deep for a fire engine to go through. In fact, documentation suggests that a fire engine may well float away in that depth. So that's why we're looking for some reassurance via policy 8G.
And you know, I think I've got a question later on. How different is that to the information that will be provided through the exception test? That you need to demonstrate that if development is taking place in areas liable to flood, that it can be safe for the lifetime of including escape routes.
Well, again, I'd reiterate that application has applied presumably the exception test and doesn't satisfy the parish.
Yeah.
That it is doing that properly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Right. We've been going an hour and 3/4. I'm just proposing a 10-minute comfort break, and then we'll deal with topic